Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fourth webinar session for Research Skills for Library Liaison. My name is Jenny Campagnolo, and I'm back to moderate today's session. I'm from Griffith Uni, and I'm also joined today by Sue Hickson from Griffith, who is the convener of the Library and Information Services Working Party, and she'll be helping me facilitate today's session, and also Jackie Wolstenholme from James Cook Uni, who's the convener of the Research Support Working Party. Just a few hints and tips before we jump into the content of today's session. Just a reminder that today's session is being recorded, like our previous three sessions. Please turn your video off if you can, as it does tend to slow down some of the functionality within Collaborate. If you would like to use your microphone, at the moment we have everyone's microphone muted, but if you'd like to ask a question via your microphone, please raise your hand using the tools in the left-hand menu, and we can turn your microphone on. Also remember, if we do turn your mic on and you'd like to ask a question via your mic, press the talk button, and that will also unmute your microphone. Feel free to post any and all questions in the chat window. Most of the names look familiar today, so I'm sure you're all familiar with the chat window in the bottom left-hand corner of the Collaborate window. So please feel free to provide comments or ask questions, and we ask that you don't send private chats during the session. Keep it friendly, professional and productive. Just a quick reminder of our Collaborate tools. So just above the participant list, you'll see a few options to choose from. Hiding under the smiley face, we have some additional emoticons for you to choose from. So use these options to let us know how you're going during the session, and so that you can alert us to the fact if you have a question or you'd like us to speed up or slow down. Let us know if you move away from the Collaborate room. Raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and at different times throughout the session, Ginny may ask for a yes or no answer, depending on the content that she's covering. So you can use the tick option to let us know your answers as well. And again, chat window just in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. So now I'm going to hand over to Jackie to introduce our speaker for today's session. Hi Jackie, we can't hear you coming through just yet. Would you like to try again?
Sorry about that. So it's Jackie here again. I'm really pleased to be introducing the speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Virginia Barber. Ginny is the Executive Officer of the Australian Open Access Support Group, and she's based in Brisbane, Australia. Ginny has a wealth of experience that she brings to this role, with a long history of working in open access publishing. She joined PLOS, the Public Library of Science, in 2004, and as one of the three founding editors of PLOS Medicine, finally becoming the Medicine and Biology Editorial Director of PLOS in 2014. Her training in publishing was at The Lancet, and where she worked before joining PLOS. Ginny studied natural sciences at the University of Cambridge, then medicine at UCL and Middlesex Hospitals, London, specialising in haematology. Her DPhil was on alpha-globin gene regulation at the IMM Oxford, so she also has research experience, and she undertook postdoctoral work at St Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. As well as being the chair As well as being the Executive Officer of the Australian Open Access Support Group, Ginny is also the Chair of the Committee on Publishing and Publication Ethics. The acronym for that is COPE, and she's the Director of the World Association of Medical Editors, WAM. She has been involved in a number of reporting guidelines, including Consort, PRISMA and TEDIA statements. Ginny's on the steering group of the All Trials Initiative, and she has an academic title as Professor at Griffith University and is also an honorary professor at the University of Queensland. So please welcome Ginny, everyone.
Hi Ginny, we can't hear you from this end. You may just need to press your talk button, I'm not sure.
How's that? Hello. How's that coming across now? Perfect. All right, good. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Well, the first thing to say is you can tell from my accent I'm not Australian. I moved here a couple of years ago. My husband's a researcher at the University of Queensland, and I've been with the Australian Open Access Support Group now for 6 months. But the sharper-eyed of you on the screen will notice that we're actually in the process of becoming the Australasian Open Access Support Group. I also know there are a lot of people on this talk, on this list who have been involved in open access in Australia for a very long time, and I'm very happy to have discussions at any time throughout the talk or later on or with as needed. So I'm going to go into telling you about where I think open access is in Australia at the moment, what some key issues are. And I will break it up into, so we can stop at various points and ask questions if you wish. So let me just do this. Okay, so this is my outline. It won't break up neatly into chunks of equal size, but I'm happy to stop at any point, as I said. Please I guess you either type your question into the chat box below and we'll unmute you. And what I'd really like to, I guess, at the end of this, get across to all of you is some really key concepts in open access, which I've developed over the time that I've been involved in this area, where I think there are some critical issues, particularly in Australasia, and where there's some critical issues in more globally. And then at the end we'll come on to my favourite topic, which is why we don't have full open access yet and how we might get through to that. Okay, so what's open access? And again, I apologise, I know some people on this who are listening to me will be very familiar with this, but I've always felt it's useful to start with a definition and to be clear that we're all talking about the same type of issues as we go through. And there is a huge amount of confusion in open access, and I do believe that one of the reasons that we have had not as much success as I'd like for us to have had in moving it forward is because of confusion about some very fundamental definitions. So when you're talking about open access, you really have to talk about how we got to where we are. And in fact, we're in a very fluid time of change within scholarly publishing. It's only 25 years since the internet started. This piece that I'm putting up here, which is from James Boyle, who has written a great deal on the web, was published in 2005 when he was talking on the 15th anniversary of the web, and we're now at the 25th anniversary this year. And he makes some really interesting points about how we've got to where we are with the internet, which is the thing that made open access possible. And what he says here is worth thinking about, in particular what he goes on to say later on in the piece, which is the reason that the web is so amazing is not because of what it is itself, but because of what people have built on it. And one of the things that has happened within publishing is that it has not really lived up to the possibilities of the web, which you would not say is the case if we look around us and how it's affected our daily lives in many other different ways. And there are some interesting reasons as to why that's the case. But for anyone who thinks that scholarly publishing has done as much as it can to exploit the internet, I would say that we actually have rather a long way to go yet. So it has, however, got us this far. So if the web is 25 years old, the history of publishing is much older. It's 350 years old this year, another notable birthday. And it only took 349 years for the Royal Society to finally wake up to the real power of the internet, and they published their first open access journal in 2014, the Royal Society of Open Science, which is a very interesting journal because it is doing a good job, I think, of beginning to exploit the potential of the web in scholarly publishing. However, the history of open access is again, is pretty brief. So if the web is 25 years old, open access really started to be talked about in 1999, 2000, when things such as PubMed Central, the open access archive in the US, came online. Biomed Central, the publisher, started to publish. Before that, of course, people were putting things online, but it was really around about that time, and then in the early 2000s, that some really fundamental concepts around open access were developed. And those have been the foundation, really, of where we've got to thus far. So if we go on to kind of use that as a way of thinking about open access, I think that you'll almost certainly have heard people talking about open access, and you may well have heard about people talking about open access evangelists and open access advocates, and we in ourselves are, I've been involved in advocacy for open access for a long time. But the truth of the matter is that open access is a tool for dissemination of use and reuse of research. And I feel that if we hold on to that as a definition and think about it as a tool, a lot of the I guess the sort of heat comes out of the discussions around it, and you can focus on what the real importance of is, and what tools we have behind that to actually enable full reuse. So this is how I think about open access, and when I talk to people about it, I reiterate that one should think of it this way. Rather than thinking about it as something that is the means to an end. Just because you give people access to information doesn't mean that they necessarily use it in the way that they need to, but they have to have access to it in the first place. So the key concept in all of this, for me, is this idea of open access being different to free access, and open access being greater than free access. So what does that mean? So this is what free access is, and you'll hear these terms often used, I think, in ways that confuse them. But as I say, if you have a way of thinking about them and having them very clear, it becomes very obvious what the differences are between the two of them, and what the important uses are that you can do with open access that you can't do with free access. So free access is that an article is free to read. But there may be an embargo period that you can't read it for. So, for example, you'll hear journal articles being embargoed for 6 or 12 months are the common time frames. It's very clear that you can't reuse free access articles unless you have specific rights associated with it have been granted. And you may well find that if you were to make a number of copies of an article or to distribute it inappropriately, you would be charged, or you may even get publishers asking you to desist from distributing. And the free rights are not enshrined forever, so they may be withdrawn at any time. So here's an example of where that happened. This was back in 2011 in a scheme called Hinari, which is organized by the World Health Organization to distribute medical, primarily, well, in this case, medical and scientific journals to countries which aren't able to afford subscriptions. In 2011, a number of the publishers who had participated and allowed distribution of their articles to Bangladesh through Hinari thought that actually Bangladesh had suddenly got a little bit richer and was now able to afford the subscriptions and pulled out their articles. And there was a huge outcry over this, but of course the publishers were actually well within their rights. They had never said that anyone had access to these articles in perpetuity through this scheme, and that they had donated them as a sort of free, as a gift, and they were entitled to withdraw that gift at any time. Actually, what happened after this was there was quite a large outcry, and the publishers reinstated access. But I think for a lot of people it really pulled up the difference between free and open access. Another example where the difference between free and open access comes is very obvious, is that if you subscribe to a journal to which you have free access, but you don't have full access to the open access to the archives, you may not be able to access the archives if you then stop subscribing, and that's a very substantial issue for many academic institutions. So by contrast, what's open access? So this is a definition from back in 2003, when a group of people working in this area got together to define what they felt were the principal characteristics of open access. There was an earlier definition of this in 2002, but this is the one that most people now use. And it has 4 important components to it. So one is the free, immediate access online, and note that it's immediate, not after an embargo. That there are unrestricted distribution and reuse rights. That the author retains the rights to the attribution. So this is very different from what happens in the subscription publishing model, where the author generally signs over their rights to the publisher. And the papers are immediately deposited in a public online archive such as PubMed Central. And there is quite some discussion about what constitutes a public online archive, and that's particularly important in Australia, where much of the open access is actually mediated through university repositories. And so open access tells you about these things. It tells you about the method of dissemination, tells you whether you can reuse the information, and whether the article is archived. And that's the term, I deliberately put open access in brackets here because just to try and reinforce the importance of the accurate use of this term. What open access doesn't tell you about, it doesn't tell you about the scope of the journal. That seems fairly obvious, but it's you might find people being confused about, in particular with regard to what I'll come on to later, the mega journals. It doesn't tell you about the quality of the journal, so you can have great open access journals, and you can have poor ones, and you can have great subscription journals and poor subscription journals, and things such as the language or the review process. And more importantly, open access is often used wrongly. And you will hear people talking about open access when they actually just mean that something is free, or they may even just mean that it's online. And that's particularly the case when you'll hear people talking about open access in a sort of pejorative way. Often what they mean is just simply something that's online, and they're attaching the term open access to it in a way that is not very accurate and is often used to try and discredit it. So there is a lot of confusion about the terminology here, and I tend to try and always look very closely when somebody's talking about something that is open access to make sure that it really is actually, that's what they mean. So I think I'm happy to just pause there just for a moment. Are there any questions about that initial part of the talk? Please either raise your hands or what's the best way to do this? Okay, I'm not seeing any raised hands. So Maureen said that she liked the distinction between free and open access. Great, that's one of my favourite favourite distinctions to make, and I think it's very important and really helpful actually if you can distinguish that for authors in your institutions, because they get very confused, I think. Okay, if I'm not seeing any confused faces, I think I will go on. But if you have any other questions, then just please come back to it. Okay, so some other definitions that I'll come on to now are around the difference between the routes to open access, and I'm going to talk here about green and gold. So there are 2 primary routes. There is a third route, which is around hybrid open access, which I will come on to later if we have time, but I'm not going to spend too much time on here. So the first route is the green repository route, and that's the route that Australasia has primarily gone down, and that involves making a copy of an article, and we're primarily talking here about research articles, via an institution's repository. So every institution within Australia has its own institutional repository. I've put up just a couple here. I know that all the institutions that will be represented here will have one. So the QUT one is called QUT ePrints, and the James Cook one is Research Online at JCU. And these are the places which primarily are the vehicle for making open access for academics in Australia. I've also put down on there, you can see an organisation called the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, which is a group which is working worldwide to try and collaborate between different institutional repositories and groups of institutional repositories to agree on things like interoperability, which, as you can imagine, is quite a big issue when you have many different institutions all with their own repository. And then the other side of it is around the gold open access publishing, which is via open access journals. Now, as Jackie said at the beginning, my background was at the Public Library of Science. So the Public Library of Science is an example of a gold open access journal publisher, which has seven journals, all of which are fully open access. And there we comply completely with all the definitions of open access that I put up earlier. Now, one of the things that has happened with the proliferation of open access journals is that there has been a large number of them coming into the marketplace, as it were, that people have been able to submit their papers to, and there is some confusion about how you determine which of whether the journals are ones that are reliable, ones that you should consider publishing with, and not. And I know that Paula Callan is going to be talking about that later on in this series, so I won't go into it. But there is one particular place that is worth looking at when you're trying to figure out whether a journal is fully open access, whether it is something you would consider recommending to academics, and that's the Directory of Open Access Journals, which is run from Scandinavia and has just gone through a very large process of changing its criteria for acceptance in an attempt to make it much more reliable. Okay. So one of the other key concepts around open access is the need to have a legal tool for open access. And again, I know this is going to be a topic of the series later on, the Creative Commons, but I will just touch on it because it's this is one of my favourite topics, is the need to have licenses that really underpin open access, how important that is. And again, this is an area where academics are often very confused. They've never had to think about this before because in the past they've just signed over their copyright to publishers and never really thought about it. And it's become very clear that this is actually an issue which they do need to engage with, but there's a lot of confusion. And the three parts of any license are the legal code, which has been written very carefully, and is now the version that we're now on to is version 4.0, which is an international legal code. The previous versions actually were more country specific, but this one is now truly international. There's a human readable code, which I'll show you what it looks like in a moment, and then there's a machine readable code, which I hate to say is actually the most important part of it. Because it enables reuse, and reuse of articles in the future is going to be incredibly important, and the things that will be doing that reuse primarily, or searching for reuse, will be the machines in the future. So it's very important that any article that you are making open access has not only something that humans read, but something that machines can read as well. However, this is what it looks like to humans, and this is just an example from one of the PLOS journals, and it says very clearly who retains the copyright, and it also tells you what you can do with an article. And this is an example of the Creative Commons Attribution License, CC BY, which simply means that this is the most liberal of the articles, and that all you have to do with this article is to attribute it to the original author, and then you may do anything you like with it. And one of my favourite kind of ways of thinking about this is that it then means that you end up using copyright in a way that is that enables reuse rather than restricting reuse. And this was put very neatly by somebody called Jan Veltrop, who has been a big mover in the open access movement. He originally worked at Springer, then he worked at Biomed Central, and he said this, that Creative Commons licenses means that copyright can be used not to make articles artificially scarce, but to maximize their dissemination. And again, this is something that is a very nice way of talking to academics if you're trying to persuade them that they don't lose any rights associated when they publish an article in an open access journal, but actually they they maintain their rights. In fact, their rights are often stronger than before, but they maximize an article's reuse. However, there is a lot of confusion around all of this, and you know, as I've said earlier, open gets used in many different terms, and one of a rather nice tool that was developed a couple of years ago, which has just very recently been updated, is this, which is called How Open Is It? It was developed by a group of organisations, which includes PLOS, the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association, and SPARC, which is a group of academic library consortia which advocates for open access in North America. And they developed this guide which shows you what it really means to be open versus closed. So they have a, no, it hasn't come, normally I have two parts which come up, but I'll show you. If you can see here, blown up is what one of these particular panels looks like. So for example, if you were to look at the reuse rights, you can see, if you go from the top, you have the most open, which is generous reuse and remixing rights, and that's the Creative Commons attribution license that I showed you earlier, and goes down right at the bottom to no reuse rights, beyond fair use, which essentially is the all rights reserved that you see on traditional subscription journal publishing. And again, this is a nice thing to be able to put in the tool of, or to put into the hands of authors if they're thinking about open access, for them to have an idea of what's going on. This is freely available online, and they are in the process of developing a website which will allow you to plug in the DOI of an individual article that you can then query how open is it compared to all the different things that are listed within the guide. Okay, so where does this take us with regard to publishing? So this is a relatively new field, you know, 20 years maximum, really. There's been a huge huge evolution of publishing within that time, and I think it is true to say that open access has driven that in a number of different ways. The first one is around the different models of how you actually set up journals. So the journals that are coming onto the market now may differ in the way that they run their editorial processes. They may, for example, they may have they may differ within their acceptance criteria. They may have open versus closed peer review. They may allow different ways of displaying information, ranging from more standard PDFs through to videos, through to data sets. And they're really redefining the way that people think about publishing. And so if I take you through this little sort of evolutionary tree, as it were, if you think about Biomed Central as being the first journal in this space, which started in the early 2000s with publishing a lot of different journals across a wide spectrum of the research literature. PLOS was sort of came after that, took a different approach, because at that point it was very important to develop journals that were high quality, and so I was involved with PLOS Medicine, which was one of the journals that attempted to do that, to really show that you could have high quality publishing. A sort of direct offshoot of that is eLife, which actually was started by somebody who used to be the editorial director at PLOS, again aimed at high quality publishing, and it's funded by 3 funders in the US, the UK, and in Germany. And the innovation there is around a very collaborative editorial process. And then a sort of direct offshoot of PLOS, which came out of PLOS One, which was the journal at PLOS, which really stopped selecting papers for their importance, but decided to select them on the basis only if they were well reported and if they were ethical, for example. A number of different journals came out of it. The two notable ones are BMJ Open, which has really done a tremendous job of expanding access to the medical literature, and took at the same time, took many principles of the BMJ along with it. And PeerJ, which again was also started by somebody who used to work at PLOS, which also has a new editorial process, and has a different funding model. And all of these are just nice examples, I think, of new innovations within this space. And it's led to a huge proliferation of different publishing models. And just to touch on a couple here that I think are really interesting, one is F1000 Research, which is doing some very interesting publishing experimentation with versioning of journals, a version of journal articles, and in association with that has open peer review. And then Knowledge Unlatched, which is a very interesting, this is KU, in green down here, which is very interesting because it's aiming to publish open access books in the humanities through a collaborative model whereby individual libraries can contribute to the payment, and then the whole collection of books is made open access, and I know that many Australian universities have collaborated with that. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions on what I've just gone through, and then I'm happy to take some questions. Hi, Maureen. Do you want to unmute yourself, or do you want to type your question? What's the easiest thing to do? Jenny, is it possible to unmute Maureen? I can't hear any question coming through. Maureen, I'm not hearing any question. Do you want to type it into the chat room, and then I'm happy to answer it that way. Whilst Maureen's doing that, I will I'll just make another comment about journal publishing. Is that I think one of the things that I hear most frequently when I talk with academics is there's sort of high anxiety about publishing in journals that they haven't heard of before, or wondering how they can really rely on whether understand whether journals are actually legitimate or not. And I think that one of the, it's astonishing to me how often they don't think to ask librarians. They often don't even seem to ask their own peers about these journals, but would sort of cheerfully go on and publish in them without really thinking about it. And I do think that there hasn't yet been enough of a discussion about ways of positively selecting for articles, for journals, as opposed to sort of pointing out the negative ones. I'm not a favour of blacklists of journals. I think there's a much better job to be done with explaining sort of the journals that are more trustworthy, as it were. Maureen, did you have a question? Because oh, there we go. Okay, I hadn't. Okay, so this is a question about ResearchGate. That's a very interesting one, and there are a number of these different types of sharing platforms that are around. So the answer about all of them is it very much depends on what the publisher is allowing what the publisher has allowed. So if, for example, it's an open access paper from PLOS or Biomed Central or PeerJ or any of those ones, the answer actually is yes. If it's in something where the publisher has not granted reuse rights, it depends, is an unfortunate answer. Some publishers do allow limited sharing within these platforms, but sometimes they have to have a specific agreement within those platforms. And so it's not always, the answer is they need to check and be careful, and if they're not sure, probably the best thing to do is to put the metadata up there, and then they can't get, that undoubtedly will be okay. Another one of this often that comes up is is Mendeley as a place for sharing. That's an interesting one in particular because it's owned by Elsevier, and Elsevier thus is developing a lot of its policies, I think, so that they can facilitate sharing on Mendeley, but they don't want to, they don't want them to lose the ability to get subscription revenue for their articles. So Jackie's asked a question about the article processing charge, and it's often a blocker in conversation about open access. So the way that I tend to talk about this is that there is also this perception, I think, that open access is a free process, that publishing is a free process, and that we could just do all of this without actually any sort of money changing hands. And I think that's a mistake to perpetuate that. And I think actually one of the things, for example, that eLife has not been hugely helpful about is because there are no charges associated with eLife at any stage, and sometimes people then get confused about, well, if I don't have to pay for publication in one open access journal, why do I have to pay for it in another? I think that, so do I think that the question that she's asked is, do I think that whether APCs will go down? I think they will. I think at the moment they're artificially high for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I think the traditional publishers who have moved this, by which I mean Elsevier, Wiley, those types of publishers who are experimenting with open access themselves, are still very keen to try and maintain their own revenues. And there was a very interesting analysis that came from the UK of two experiments, or two groups that are paying for open access via article processing charges. The Wellcome Trust, which is a big funder of charitable funder, and the government agencies. And what they showed was that article processing charges were highest amongst the traditional publishers and were highest for hybrid journal publishing. And that's hybrid journal publishing is when you have an article that is open access within a subscription journal. And ironically, those are the charges for article processing of hybrid articles is the highest of all. So I think that what is happening right now is there will be a market adjustment. I think that people will begin to understand that that currently in some areas there is overcharging for article processing charges, and there will become to be an accepted level. I don't know, for example, though, whether or not there will be some journals where authors will always be willing to pay an high article processing charge, but I think that the experiment that's going on in the UK will help inform that to some great extent. Okay, so if there's no other questions, I'll go on to the next part of the presentation. So what's happening here? So as I've said, the Australian approach to open access is largely green, and that has been underpinned by a number of different initiatives. I wasn't here when these started, but the most critical one probably was when the Australian government funded the development of open access repositories back in 2007-2009, which led to all institutions having their own repository. Also very important were mandates from the two big funders, the NHMRC and the ARC, for open access, and that's underpinned by principles coming out of the Australian Government Open Access and Licensing Framework, OSGOL, which has stated some principles around open access, or access which really is that the default should be open, and has developed a framework around that institutions and organisations should try and live up to. This is particularly relevant for government data, but I think that it's important that the principle has been stated. It's also just worth noting that there is not an overarching open access policy for the whole of Australia for research outputs. The government has just got a consultation out right now, and they've indicated that they may well be thinking about that, so kind of watch this space. But the two most important policies are the NHMRC and the ARC, which started in 2012-2013, which differ slightly depending on the outputs. So, for example, the ARC applies to books and book chapters, the NHMRC is journal publications. But these are now pretty well established. My understanding is that these are constantly in the process of being reviewed, and there may be another review coming up shortly. But there are some particular things that underpin it. So both of the AARC and the NHMRC have put in the need for grants to be acknowledged on publications to allow good tracking, to have early deposition of metadata into institutional repositories, that the primary version that is acceptable for these policies is the author-accepted manuscript, so that's not the journal version, and that's because of the issues around availability of journal versions. And that there is an important constituent of reporting, so that if it's not possible to make copies available, then this has to be clearly declared when individuals are reporting back to the ARC and NHMRC. And I mean, what's good, I think, is that the ARC have this requirement to submit plans for communicating research results. I think what I see these policies as, looking at them as something of an outsider, is that there is an intention to disseminate results as widely as possible. But I don't think these policies as yet are as fully formed as they could be, and I would hope that there will be some sort of a firming up and perhaps reviewing of these policies in the next year or so to sort of deal with some of the issues that have arisen. But there are some specific points that are required, so just a couple of things that you might find useful when you're talking about them. So these flowcharts were developed by my predecessor at the Open Access Support Group, and I understand they've been useful when librarians have been talking to academics about the policies. I'm in the process of looking at all of our materials on the website to make sure they're up to date, and I'm very happy to have feedback if you find that these are useful or not useful, or if there are new things coming in. And although, sorry, just go back to one thing, just to say one thing is that I'm not involved in the day-to-day of helping academics comply with these policies, and I would actually very much welcome any feedback from anyone of you who comes across issues when they're talking to academics about this, or if there are any changes that that you get to hear about that I don't, because some of the implications of the policies are very much in the actual application of them, and it's often not clear until academics sort of start to deposit their articles, what the real issues are. And I think that I had a conversation recently with somebody at the ARC, and I know that they have said they are looking again at their policies, and it will be interesting to see if anything changes in the sort of the short term. Just coming back to the other aspect of open access here is around the institutional open access policies. So these are separate to the government ones, separate to the ARC ones, and a good place to kind of start to look at these is something which is the repository of open access. The policies which have been developed across. Policies that have been developed globally are harvested by this site called RawMap. What they do here is a very sort of blunt harvesting of policies. And when I went in and checked this earlier this year, and actually went back a couple of times, not everything is completely accurate. However, you get a sense from this of how the number of policies are going up. I'm going to be doing something very shortly which is aiming to collect all the repository and the policies information across all the institutions in Australia, and I'll be feeding it back to them to make this as up to date as possible. But what this points out in particular is the fact there's quite a lot of confusion between the different policies at the governmental level, at the institutional level, at the funder level. And this really plays into concerns that academics often have, I think, which is that they're not always clear which policies they should be complying with. And this was found in the UK in particular. There is a real difference of policies, for example, at the funding level and the institutional level, and this has led to sort of not very great compliance. So I think if there is one area where it would be useful for governments and funders and institutions to put their heads together is an attempt to try and simplify the policies as far as possible, so that academics really only have to think of one thing when they're trying to comply. So that's the goal. Those are the green, primarily green open access policies. Gold open access is of less importance here than elsewhere. And so this was a study done by Danny Kingsley back in 2013, and she showed that gold open access publishing, which is via the journals, constitutes about 10% of publishing at that time. We probably need to do this again to see what is increasing, whether this is increasing or not. Again, this is incredibly dependent on whether or not academics are able to get funding. Jackie's touched on that. The open access policies of the AARC and NHMRC allow academics to use their grant support, but they don't provide it as a line item. And that's been very important elsewhere in encouraging academics to use their funded money to do that. It's not happening to an extent here that we see, for example, happens in the UK, where the primary mode for open access is actually now turning out to be gold, and that's because the funders are specifically encouraging and enabling their research money to go towards that. Okay, so I will move on very quickly to what's happening in OA elsewhere, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but I just want to point out a couple of things. So here's the same diagram that I showed you earlier for Australasia or Oceania. So in contrast, this has more than 500 organisations on it that have open access policies. Actually, I think this is quite a large underestimate, because many institutions are developing their own policies, and it's even happening at the level of subunits for research organisations. Are these policies all consistent? Well, if they're not consistent within Australia, you can imagine they're absolutely not consistent globally. And one of the groups that is working quite hard to try and encourage institutions to develop policies that are consistent, or at least that have specific principles within them, is the open access group at Harvard, which is led by Peter Suber, who has been somebody who has been a great advocate for open access, and who spent a lot of time thinking about the nitty-gritty of publishing and the policies required for it. And they have developed a guide for institutional repository for institutional open access mandates that I think will be very helpful, in particular when people are looking at kind of comparing policies across different countries. But as you can see, it's growing fairly dramatically, and interestingly, it's mostly happening at the level of the research organisation. So I think there is also a bit of a tension between what will happen, what academics will do for their research organisation compared to what they will do for their funder. Okay, so just to touch quickly on two places where I think which are important. One is the UK. There's a great in the UK, the primary mode of open access is gold. That's via article processing charges paid to journals. This followed what's called the Finch report, which is a inquiry that was chaired by Dame Janet Finch, and which came out really of one particular government minister, Conservative government minister, who wanted her to address how one could open up access to journal publications. There's a lot of controversy about how this all came to the conclusions it did. The Finch report included a large number of different groups within it, including commercial publishers. And very interestingly enough, what happened was the recommendation was they went down the route of funding article processing charges to across all the journals, so not just the new open access journals, but also to publishers who were providing open access via hybrid journals. And the outcome, as I said earlier, has been quite controversial in that it has been shown that a large amount of the money for article processing charges is now going to some of these larger publishers. And there are real, I think, implications there for whether or not this is a good use of funding. And I don't think anyone has yet quite figured that out, but I know that some of the academics in the UK are scrutinising this very carefully, and some of the funders are again looking at their policies. In the USA, the primary open access is largely green, and that's in response to a White House directive from the Office of Science and Technology there, a requirement to make publicly funded work open access. There's a bill actually going through the US legislature right now, which is called the FAST Act, which will define some of the parameters of this open access. But again, it is most likely to be, it is green open access, plus or minus some embargo period times for the published article to be available online. So again, I think this is quite interesting because there is an element of pragmatism in the US. It was almost certainly always going to be this type of route. It just remains to be seen how this will play out in a sort of larger, over the next few years. Okay, so let me just move on to the last little bit. So what is the Open Access Support Group? So we were founded in 2013 by 9 founder organisations. But we now have New Zealand, so we've just become the Australasian one. We have a number of things that we aim to do. So we want to be at the source of good information on open access here, particularly in regard to mandates and at the level of the funders. We have some resources that you're welcome to use and download, and they do get a fair amount of use. And when we have a blog which has explained some of the OA stuff that's going on, and I'm going to be including more of that over the next few months. This is the website. These are our aims. It's not just around providing information, we also do a fair bit of advocacy and aim to raise awareness. So we're always very happy to hear to anyone who's working in this field. That's our website and some of our resources. So I'm going to end, and I realise I've done a quick trip through quite a lot of stuff. I just want to end with a couple of slides that I think are quite striking. It seems when I first started in open access, which was about 12 years ago, I said that fairly confidently that we would have open access in 10 years. Well, here we are 12 years later, and we don't have. So what's going on? I think there's a number of different things, but here are some really big issues. The green versus gold debate is a very important one because, as Jackie's kind of alluded to, there is no overall level at the moment of APCs, and there is no additional funding in many mandates for gold OA. So researchers don't have that as an opportunity if they don't have the funding. There's a lot of confusion over licenses. The publishers are very keen to maintain their revenues, and so some of the discussions that are happening definitely have that as its mind. And there are some complicated areas where it's not really been clear what a good solution is. So books and monograph publishing in the humanities has been particularly difficult in this area. Actually, ironically, I think that the book publishing has been very well served by some new initiatives such as Knowledge Unmatched, and it may well be there are some new business models that will serve particular areas very well. And I think that what I do see as a future is a sort of mixed economy, a sort of ecosystem with different models of publishing. Hi, Jenny. I'm just about to finish. I've got 2 more slides and then I will stop. So this is where I think we're at. We're at a really critical time in publishing. A very interesting paper came out a couple of months ago which showed how publishing is being consolidated in the hands of a very few publishers. I think that this poses tremendous challenges, and it might well be very important for what happens next because they are increasingly driving the economy. Elsevier in particular owns 25% of the entire scientific output, and again, that is something that is driving discussions in many different ways. Question that's come up, which I would love to actually have as a suggestion, which is from Jackie. Do we think open access publications should be used as a measure of research performance? I actually think this should be built into open access policies and into government policies, particularly around not just open access, but any sort of open data initiatives as well. A general reward for making things open. Currently, academics are almost punished for doing this. There is definitely a need, I think, to have a way of rewarding people for doing this kind of good behavior. Okay, so I think that one just point to come across when you're talking with your academics is that there are important decisions that academics need to make every day when they're considering where to publish. If they choose to publish in closed access journals, they need to be very aware of their rights. If they choose to publish in open access journals, they need to do as much as they can to disseminate as fully as they can, and they need to be supported in that by their institutions and by the support structure. It's very clear to me, again, when I often talk with academics, that there needs to be sort of multiple discussions at multiple different levels, which vary from how do I manage this paper right now, through to discussions with academics who are able to change policies at an institutional level, and all of those discussions are very important if we're really going to actually properly use open access. A quick plug for Open Access Week 2015, which is open for collaboration. I'm in the process of pulling together resources on that. And then here's just a list of my resources, some resources you might want to look at. I'm happy to provide links to anything else that came up in the talk. Thanks very much, and I'm sorry, I realise I'm very close to time. Happy to take questions now or to have anything later on. Hi, Eric. Hi, Erica. Did you have a question? I'm not hearing any questions if somebody is trying to talk. Jenny's pointed out the link to the Survey Monkey, so feel free to be as oh, very good. Feel free to you know, I would love to have feedback on what's useful and what's not. I would particularly find it very useful to have information on what you need to have to talk with your academics about this. And again, I'm very aware there are a lot of people within this, you know, who are on this the discussion right now who are very experienced in open access and who've been working it in Australia for, you know, much longer than I have. And I think that, again, one of the issues that I do see very often from time to time that that you have to tailor your information and understand who it is you're talking to, and it's absolutely what works for an academic in Australia will be different from what works in an academic in the UK, for example. One other thing, actually, if I can just ask for your feedback on one specific thing, is I'm in the process of developing or changing the FAQs that we have on the Open Access Support Group website. If you have FAQs that are you're getting all the time, I would very much find that helpful. So please put that. I mean, you know, there's quite a few that I would be aware of, but if you have ones that you think that need to be specifically answered, please put that into the SurveyMonkey form. Okay, I'll stop talking now. Jackie or Jenny, is there anything that I should wrap up with?
Thanks, Ginny. Sorry about that. We were all muted and we couldn't turn on our talk button. Doesn't look like we have any more questions coming through. But we just want to convey our greatest thanks for today's session. I know I found it very informative and really useful, and there's a lot of great links that I'll be heading back to check out after the session. So thanks very much for your time, and thanks to everyone for logging on to today's session. We hope you found it useful.
Great, thanks very much.
Yes, thanks, Ginny. Thanks, Ginny. It's Jackie here. I just wanted to say thank you as well. And that was a great presentation, and it gives everyone a really good solid footing to be able to talk about open access. So thank you.